Good morning. I want to thank you all again, particularly the planners of this convention, and of course, as always, my friend, your bishop, Bishop Gibbs. I was just talking with him about how really impressed I am that this diocese is willing to dig so deeply into these conversations concerning not simply social justice, but the conversation that seems to be one that this country is uncomfortable with taking, let alone individuals in the church and diocese, this social justice as it relates to this matter of race. And so, as uncomfortable as these conversations can be, they are also conversations that we just simply must have. And so I thank you for the conversation. And I hope that on this morning, I can, in some way, help us as a people to move a little bit further along the road. And so I began. We all know the numbers, but it is good to be reminded of them. As reported by the Sentencing Project, African American males are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white males and 2.5 times more likely than Latino males. Given current trends, the report continues, 1 out of every 3 African American males born today can expect to go to prison in his lifetime, as can 1 of every 6 Latino males, compared to 1 of every 17 white males. When we look at the numbers by states, they are even more startling. Again, taken from the Sentencing Project, African Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at a rate that is 5.1 times the imprisonment of whites. In 5 states, Iowa, Minnesota, New Jersey, Vermont, and Wisconsin, the disparity is more than 10 to 1. In 12 states, more than half of the prison population is African American, with my current home state of Maryland topping the nation with a 72% of an African American prison population. Within the state prison system, Latinx Americans are imprisoned at a rate that is 1.4 times the rate of whites. The disparity of Latinx Americans to whites is particularly high in such states as Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New York, where the ratio to whites is 3 to 4 times to 1. The numbers are just as disconcerting when it comes to women. For while there are many more men in prison than women, again quoting from the Sentencing Project, the rate of growth for female imprisonment, as some of us, by the way, know, has outpaced men by more than 50% between 1980 and 2014. Between those times, the number of incarcerated women increased by more than 700%. In 2014, the imprisonment rate for African American women was twice that of white women, and Latino women was 1.5 times that of white women. Even more disconcerting is what has become known as a school-to-prison pipeline. This pipeline is evident in the racially disproportionate rates of school suspensions and juvenile sentencing. According to recent Department of Education data, Black males are 3 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended from school, while Black girls are 6 times more likely than their white counterparts. Moreover, Black girls are the fastest growing population in the juvenile justice system, perhaps reflecting the particular vulnerability of Black girls given the intersectional realities of gender and race. A recent study by Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Equality, it came out just a month or so ago, found that adults view Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers, especially in the age range of 5 to 14. perhaps accounting for the fact that black girls are disciplined much more often and much more severely than their white peers, both in school and within the juvenile justice system. It is interesting to note that this study suggests that while black boys are often viewed as older and criminalized by the age of 10, unlike their white counterparts, this is taking place at the age of 5, a much earlier age for black girls. If these numbers are not disconcerting enough when it comes to the stark realities of young black and brown lives, the facts about poverty are even more disconcerting. According to reports from the Children's Defense Fund, black and Latino children continue to suffer disproportionately from poverty, with the youngest children most at risk of being poor. 1 in 3 black children and more than 1 in 4 Hispanic children were poor in 2014 compared to 1 in 8 white children. Nearly 1 in 6 black children and 1 in 9 Hispanic children were living in extreme poverty compared to 1 in 17 white children. More than 1 in 3 black children under the age of 5 were poor. 1 in 5 were extremely poor. While black children have the highest poverty rate in this country, the largest number of poor children are indeed Hispanic. In short, what we find in our nation is that black and brown bodies are trapped in a cycle of violence, from poverty to incarceration to death. And most significantly, these numbers tell us something about this time of division that our nation now faces. For the point of the matter is, this time of division that our nation faces is about more than cultural wars or political differences. Rather, this time presents to us a fundamental question and concern about who we are and who we want to be as a people, as a nation, and indeed as a church. We must ask ourselves, what does it mean to be church in these our times when we find ourselves, for all intents and purposes, relitigating Civil War realities? We can answer this question only by first and foremost telling the truth about who we are, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth may make us feel. For this is what we know, cliche or not, telling the truth is the beginning of being set free from whatever it is that prevents us from being the nation we claim to be, one committed to justice and freedom of all, and from being the people of God that we must be, that is a church, followers of Jesus' movement toward God's reign of justice. And so this morning, I want to try to dig deep down into that pit of sometimes uncomfortable truth, so to understand how it is that we continue to face these divisions of race that are not, again, just rhetorical, political, or cultural, but divisions that have profound implications for the bodies and lives of black and brown peoples. And that truth begins by recognizing the realities of two narratives that have come together to bring us to where we are today as a nation, and narratives that indeed shape our understanding of what it means to be a church. These narratives are narratives of white supremacy and anti-blackness. The coming together of these narratives make attacks upon black bodies in particular, and brown bodies as well, almost inevitable. Again, worse yet, both of these narratives corrupt our very sacred humanity, thus distorting, if not betraying, our very relationship with God. Therefore, this morning, in the brief time I have before me, I will look at these two narratives and the implications of them for us as a church and people of God. Let me turn first to this narrative of anti-Blackness. The narrative of anti-Blackness became most palpable with Europeans' earliest incursions into the African continent. While ancient Greek and Roman scholars were certainly a chauvinistic people when it came to their appraisal of their own people's body aesthetic, there is little evidence that color prejudice was integral in their thought or culture. Even as the Greeks described the African as burnt people, this description did not imply a stigma of color. Rather, it pointed to their belief concerning the impact living close to the sun had on a people's pigmentation. In the main, the reality of color prejudice is of Western origination, coming into full relief with the earliest European encounters with Africa. While the belief that Africans were meant to be slaves was prevalent prior to Europeans' encroachment upon the African continent, an anti-Black narrative was not as apparent until their arrival. For as historian Winthrop Jordan says, quote, one of the fairest-skinned nations, the English, suddenly came face to face with one of the darkest peoples on the earth, end quote. The color difference was so arresting that these early European explorers of Africa made little of African people's diverse skin tones. Instead, they described them all as, quote unquote, Black. Whether describing Africans as Black was initially done with purposeful and malicious intent is debatable. What is clear is that skin color mattered to the Europeans in their encounters with a people seemingly starkly different from themselves. Furthermore, Black was not a benign signifier. No less an authority than the Oxford English Dictionary had already established whiteness as a sign of innocence, purity, and goodness, while Blackness signified vileness, danger, and evil. As far apart as the English complexion was from the African, the meaning of whiteness was from Blackness. Consequently, to describe the Africans as Black ensured that the Eurocentric color-defined gaze would not remain innocent, if it ever was. It was only the beginning of an anti-Blackness that provided the aesthetic justification for the enslavement and other violent acts against the bodies of Black women and men. As crucial as skin color was, it was not the only physical feature that astonished these white intruders and soon-to-be pillagers of Africa, and thus not the only aspect of the anti-Black narrative. Europeans also noted with ominous condescension the fullness of the Africans' lips, the broadness of their noses, and the texture of their hair. It soon became clear that there was more at play than just a shocked realization of how diverse human creation was. In the European imagination, the African's physiognomy signaled a genetic difference. When coupled with the dissimilarity of dress and customs, not to speak of religions, the European interlopers became convinced that the Blackness of the Africans was more than skin deep. They believed it penetrated through to the very character and soul, which, by the way, some Europeans claimed Africans did not possess, thereby signaling a people who were so thoroughly uncivilized, the Europeans believed, that they were more beastly than human. That Africans were likened to beasts was consequential. This beastly descriptor implied not simply that they were wild and uncivilized, but also hypersexualized. As Winthrop Jordan points out, the terms bestial and beastly carried with them sexual connotations. Thus, when an Englishman described the Africans as beastly, he was frequently as much registering a sense of sexual shock as describing swinish manners. So says Jordan. The similarities that Europeans registered between the Africans and the apes, more specifically orangutans, gave way to further insinuations concerning the Africans' sexual habits. The unfortunate circumstance was that the Europeans' first encounter with orangutans coincided with their first encounter with Africans. Hence, they were just as startled by these animals' similarities to humans as they were by what they considered the Africans' subhuman qualities. It therefore required a small leap in the European imagination to conceive of an inherent connection between the African apes and the African people. Once such a tie was forged, it was an even easier leap of logic for Europeans to assume, as Jordan remarks, a beastly copulation or conjuncture between the two species. By crafting such an indecent link, again, as pointed out by many historians, Europeans were able to give vent to their feelings that Negroes, that is Africans, were a lewd, lascivious, and wanton people. It was in this way that blackness came to signify a people who were grossly uncivilized and dangerously hypersexualized. That the early European encroachers onto the African continent posited a sexual connection between wild animals and uncivilized Africans only further fortified the notion that African women and men were dangerous. If nothing else, it was clear to the white interlopers that these were a people who needed to be patrolled and controlled, given their desolate character and beastly disposition. Now, before I go further, one thing must be made clear. This narrative, which is a narrative of anti-blackness, is violent in and of itself. It is a narrative that negates the very humanity of a people. Therefore, it is inherently violent. We must be clear. Any ideology or system of thought that objectifies another human being must be understood as violent. Furthermore, such a system of thought initiates a system of violence in which the oppressed, in this instance black bodies, become entrapped. In short, the narrative of anti-blackness spawns, nurtures a multi-dimensional cycle of violence against black bodies. This brings us to the centrality of this narrative to the American identity and its interaction with whiteness in America. The anti-black narrative arrived in America with the Puritan and Pilgrims. When America's Pilgrim and Puritan forebears fled England in search of freedom, they believed themselves descendants of an ancient Anglo-Saxon people, free, quote unquote, from the taint of intermarriages, a people who uniquely possessed, they believed, high moral values and an instinctive love for freedom. Fueled by this myth, these early Americans crossed the Atlantic with a vision to build a nation that was politically, culturally, if not demographically, true to their exceptional Anglo-Saxon heritage. As such, America was envisioned as a testament to the sacredness of Anglo-Saxon character and values, if not people. American exceptionalism was considered Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. In this regard, to be an Anglo-Saxon was the measure of what it meant to be an American. American identity was equated with Anglo-Saxon identity. In order to safeguard America's mythic Anglo-Saxon vision and sense of self, a pervasive culture of whiteness was born. The point of the matter was that whiteness became the perfect way to mask the fact that America was an immigrant nation with migrants, even from Europe, who were not actually Anglo-Saxon. The elevation of whiteness was inevitable since, as noted earlier, whiteness had come to signify purity and moral innocence, a skin tone therefore befitting exceptional Anglo-Saxons. Inevitably, therefore, whiteness forged an impregnable wall between America's myth of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism and that which might compromise it, such as those persons on the other side of whiteness. You with me? Great. Hence, white culture, with an anti-black narrative as its defining feature, was born at the very founding of America. For there was nothing that opposed whiteness more than blackness, not only in color, but also in what it signified about a people. To reiterate, blackness signified a lewd, dangerous, and immoral people, while whiteness signaled a chaste, innocent, and virtual people. In the words of legal scholar Cheryl I. Harris, the amalgamation of various European strains into an American identity, that is Anglo-Saxon identity, was facilitated by an oppositional definition of black as other, end quote. It is this oppositionality between whiteness and blackness that forms the basis of white supremacist ideology. With the emergence of white supremacist ideology, two things become clear. First, perhaps stating the obvious, the ideology of white supremacy depends upon the narrative of anti-blackness, since the notion of white superiority rests on the ideal of black inferiority. Second, whiteness itself must be regarded as a violent identity construct, inasmuch as it is defined in denigrating opposition to that which is non-white, notably blackness. This brings us back to the fact of white culture. To reiterate, if America's mythic Anglo-Saxon white identity was to be protected, then blackness had to be repelled at all costs. And this is the job of white culture. White culture, in its various manifestations, is that which perpetuates the ideal of white superiority, especially through its legal and extra-legal expressions. It helps whiteness to stand its ground, if you will, against any corrupting or threatening intrusions into the white Anglo-Saxon space, such as black bodies. In this regard, I'm sorry to say, there is no getting around it. Anti-black violence is in America's DNA. Now, before I say more, I must point out a unique bearing this narrative of anti-blackness has had upon black women from the earliest beginnings, helping us to understand the roots of the study that I mentioned earlier regarding black girls. For the European gaze was not only shaped by color, but also by gender. Thus, it involved a racialized standard of beauty that indicated whether or not one was a proper woman. The visage of a beautiful woman in the English mind was well established during the Elizabethan period, with the Queen serving as the perfect exemplar of it. Once again, this aesthetic assessment was not benign when it came to black women in America, especially given the enslaved realities of their lives. As far away as black women were from the standard of white beauty, they were also far from the standard of femininity and what it meant to be a lady. As is well documented, black women became the perfect foil to white women. While white women were considered virginal, pure angels in need of protection, placed on a pedestal, black women were considered wanton, lascivious Jezebels in need of controlling, and of course, always most vulnerable to rape. And certainly, these women were not in need of nurture, thus explaining again the earlier study regarding the perception of young black girls. And so, the question now becomes, how do these narratives of anti-blackness and white supremacy continue to function today? To be sure, the statistics, get that out, I opened with reflect the reality of these narratives as they manifest themselves in forms of systemic and structural racism. But we must also tell the truth about the matter at hand, even as hard as it is to hear, in the way in which these narratives have boldly appeared again onto our nation's landscape with impunity. how they have appeared today in such a way, again, that may be uncomfortable for us to face, but a truth that we must tell. The narrative of anti-Blackness, in its centrality to American identity today, if we're to tell the truth about this narrative, we must begin with the reality of making America great again. Simply put, during his campaign and now presidency, Mr. Trump guilefully exploited America's defining Anglo-Saxon myth while dangerously revitalizing the culture of whiteness that serves to protect it. It is not about politics. It is about who we want to be as a people. We must face the fact that Donald Trump's vision to make America great again is essentially a 21st century manifestation of America's Anglo-Saxon exceptionalist myth and the culture of white supremacy with its concomitant narrative of anti-Blackness that protects it. Moreover, his mantra of greatness has served, my friends, as more than a dog whistle. It has been a clarion call, as we have seen, to action for those who have clung tightly to the Anglo-Saxon vision of America. No one made this clearer than past imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, David Duke, when he said, and I quote him, "We are determined to take our country back. We are going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump. That's what we believe in. That's why we voted for Donald Trump, because he said he is going to take our country back. That's what we got to do," end quote. Just as a Unite the Right rally, as we saw in Charlottesville, should come as no surprise, neither should President Trump's refusal to unapologetically and unambiguously denounce the violence that is white supremacy and religious bigotry. Far from rejecting the white supremacist anti-Black groups and their violent ideologies, unfortunately, Mr. Trump has emboldened them with a birtherism crusade, along with racist, Islamophobic, and xenophobic rhetoric. This runs smoothly into wall-building policies, law and order, and nationalistic immigration policies as well. Essentially, Mr. Trump's rhetoric and policies have played into, we must recognize that they have played into the bigoted fears and stereotypes that fuel white supremacy and anti-Blackness, thereby making various expressions of white supremacist violence predictable, if not inevitable, and unfortunately, seemingly acceptable. To be sure, the politics of Donald Trump and white supremacist beliefs reflect the inherent danger of America's defining Anglo-Saxon myth. When it expresses itself, it always makes people the problem. Hence, to make America great again is to take the country back from the problem people, that is, non-white peoples, which brings us to the way in which perhaps this Make America Great Again rhetoric carries forth the narrative of anti-Blackness. In a June 2013 tweet, Mr. Trump said, "It is the overwhelming amount of violent crimes in our major city, of violent crimes in our cities is committed by Black and Hispanics, a tough subject." He, of course, later doubled down on this version of reality as he continually repeated some version of his observation concerning America's inner cities. You will recall during the campaign him saying, "African Americans, quote unquote, Hispanics are living in hell because it's so dangerous. You walk down the street and you get shot." It has become clear in this rhetoric that African Americans and Latinos and those people of color are synonymous with crime, and therefore these people are the problem to America's greatness. So again, it is no wonder that we are witnessing a resurgence of bigoted violence, or for that matter, executive calls for bans, orders, and policies that prevent certain peoples from enjoying the full rights and privileges of citizenship. Moreover, even for those who do not support the blatant white supremacist policies, we must recognize that something perhaps even more insidious has occurred for the unsuspecting good people who sit in our pews. The anti-Black narrative that is central to America's collective identity, American consciousness, and consequently, it has successfully implanted deep within the American psyche the image of the Black body as a dangerously criminal body and an ever-present threat to whiteness. Numerous studies show this to be the case. They reveal that when white people in particular see a Black body, they see a criminal. Indeed, these studies reveal an almost automatic, unconscious response to Black bodies as if these bodies are threatening and criminal in and of themselves. In this same line, there are various other ways in which a narrative of anti-Blackness shows up, perhaps unwittingly, such as in white America's responses to protests. According to a most recent survey conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute, 67% of white Americans believe protesting against the government's unfair practices are good for the nation. However, when asked the same question, but specifically about protests led by Black people, that number dropped to 48%. The point of the matter is, you hear that? The point of the matter is that as long as the violent narrative of anti-Blackness is a decisive aspect of America's mythic Anglo-Saxon identity, then Black bodies will be disproportionately impacted by denigrating and deadly violence and never given the full privileges of citizenship, let alone the respect as human beings. To reiterate, the narrative of anti-Blackness is violent, as its sole purpose is the denigration and dehumanization of Black people and those who are regarded as Black by a narrative of white supremacy. And so what are we to do about it as people of God? This brings us to the matter of the cross. The cross represents power that denigrates human bodies, destroys lives, and preys on the most vulnerable in society. As the cross is defeated, so too is that power. In God's resurrection of Jesus, God defeated the cross through nonviolent, life-affirming force. It cannot be stressed enough that God's resurrecting power is one that by definition represents the sacred integrity of all human bodies and the sanctity of all human life. This is significant in two ways as we reflect upon the violence that violates Black and brown lives. Black feminist, literary artist, and social critic Audre Lorde once said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." She said, "They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change," end quote. What the crucifixion resurrection event reveals is that God does not use the master's tools. God does not utilize the violence exhibited in the cross to defeat deadly violence itself. As Lorde suggests, using the master tools may bring about a temporary solution, but it does not bring an end to the culture of deadly anti-Black white supremacist violence. As such, only the most narrow parameters of change are possible and allowable. This implies that the only way to defeat violent power is with nonviolent means. There is no doubt, and I'll say something about that in a minute before we get all comfy. There is no doubt that the cross represents the depth and scope of human violence. The cross, in this respect, represents the consuming violence of our world. It points to a world that is saturated thoroughly with violence. This violence includes not simply the physical brutality meant to harm bodies, but also the systems and structures and narratives and constructs that do harm, creating things like a mass incarceration system, creating things like poverty and cultures of death that lead to prison to school, school to prison pipelines, including, of course, narratives of anti-Blackness and all of the systems and structures it fosters in conjunction with the narrative of white supremacy. These things are violent. To reiterate, anything, if you don't remember anything else, remember that anything that devalues the life of another is violent. Through Jesus, God enters into this world of violence, yet does not take it into God's self. Thus, God responds to the violence in the world not in an eye for an eye manner. Instead, God responds in a way that negates and denounces the violence that indeed perverts and demeans the integrity of human lives. God accomplishes this by affirming life, as seen in the very resurrection of Jesus. God shows a pathway to nurture and foster life. Essentially, God responds to the violence of the cross in a nonviolent yet forceful way that is life-affirming. Put simply, the protest of Jesus was one that affirmed through word and ministry the life of those that the violent systems and structures of his day continually disavowed. And so we should understand that God's violence is not passive. Rather, it is a forceful response that proactively protects the integrity of everyone's sacred humanity and therefore life. Again, this is clear as one recognizes that Jesus was crucified not because he prayed too long in the garden, but because of his active, proactive resistance to the violent political and religious powers and structures of his time that trapped oppressed people in violence, hence crucifying realities of living, as well as because of his advocacy consistently on their behalf. The point is that while violence, like anti-Blackness and white supremacy, seek to negate and to harm to the body of people, nonviolence seeks to free bodies from denigrating and deadly violence. Not resorting to violence breaks the very cycle of violence itself. However, resisting violence and advocating for those who are indeed victimized by violence, that changes the world. It is in this way that the crucifixion resurrection event reflects nothing less than a proactive counter-narrative to the crucifying narrative of violence. And this brings us, I'm coming to a close, I promise, to the matter of narratives and what we as a church can do. Even as people must consistently resist and dismantle the systems and structures that serve to protect the myth of Anglo-Saxon white exceptionalism, something just as essential must be done to counter the various narratives of violence against Black and brown bodies. That is, there must be an actual counter-narrative that affirms the value of Black and brown bodies. These narratives must disrupt the collective consciousness of America, especially white America, if Black and brown bodies are ever to truly be free from the various violent manifestations of America's whiteness and anti-Blackness that, again, is so much a part of America's identity. And this is where our churches and faith communities must take the lead. If indeed we are people of the cross, then we must show forth the counter-narrative that is the cross in the very realities of being church. In this regard, for instance, the refrain, "Black Lives Matter," is just as significant as the movement's active protests against the systemic and structural violence perpetuated against Black lives. For the refrain itself offers a direct counter-narrative to a narrative of anti-Blackness as it loudly affirms the sacred value of Black lives. So in the end, it is essential that the Black Lives Matter refrain be consistently repeated in the public square. But there are other ways that we in our churches can disrupt the white narrative of supremacy that degrades non-white bodies. Such disruption begins with what goes on, for instance, in our churches in terms of worship or the fabric of our churches. What, for instance, are the color of the sacred images that we have in our churches? Brown and Black Christ belong not simply in Black and Latinx churches, but they belong most especially in white churches. Our theologies must reflect the importance of a God who is understood in our theologies and icons, who is understood only, God is understood only through the diversity of God's creation. If we are to know God, we must experience that God through the fullness of God's richly diverse human creation. That is, through all those who bear God's image. Moreover, if we are going to counter those images that demonize and degrade Black bodies, then we must put forth images that reveal them as sacred, not only as cauldrons, not as cauldrons of evil, but as cauldrons of that which is divine. So again, the images and icons within our churches must be bathed in more than whiteness. At the same time, we must be vigilant in our churches regarding the stories we read to our children and the characters that they encounter in books and in the Bible. We know a recent study showed that of 3,200 children's books published in the United States in 2014, only 14% of those had Black, Latino, Asian, or Native American main characters. This cannot be the case in the books we introduce to our children in our churches, let alone in our homes, if ever we are to disrupt the narratives of anti-Blackness and white supremacy. We must change the color of the characters of the books we read to our children. The role of churches in this regard becomes even more important when we realize that according to another recent study, fully 3/4, 75% of white Americans report that the network of people with whom they discuss important matters, 75%, that network is entirely white, with no minority presence, while 15% report having a more racially mixed social network. Bottom line is that the formation of the kind of spirituality that fosters sacred regard for those who are not white and counters the sinful narratives of anti-Blackness and white supremacy begins with cross-cultural racial engagement that emphasizes the sacredness of Black bodies, brown bodies, thus making the connections between Black bodies and God, showing them as revelatory indeed of the one we call divine. And here is the thing. Inasmuch as a lack of cross-cultural racial literacy and engagement promotes narratives of violence, and it does, then this lack is anti-God. It is blasphemous, which further means that a church that does not promote cross-cultural and racial literacy, that it means that that church also becomes blasphemous, as it does not reflect the one who is our God. In the final analysis, in all that we do, our churches must follow the way that in fact led Jesus to the cross, and that is the way of sanctuary and witness. To be sanctuary means that our churches must be gracious spaces for all who feel targeted by social, political, or ecclesiastical practices, policies, or ideologies. They must be nurturing spaces that allow, or creative spaces rather, that allow people to express and grow into the fullness of their sacred humanity. And they must foster brave spaces, rich with spiritual resources that allow people like ourselves, to assert moral courage and manifest the love of God within challenging and hostile contexts like we find ourselves in today. And as witnesses, our churches must resist, call out, and dismantle any racist, bigoted, misogynistic, xenophobic, heterosexist, transphobic policies, behaviors, systems, and structures in our society and in our church. And our churches, as witnesses, must then construct systems, structures, and ways of thinking and being that reflect the perfect justice and love of God. We as a nation and as a church find ourselves today at a point of decision. Are we going to be a nation that reflects its democratic rhetoric of justice and freedom for all? Or are we going to be a nation that reflects the myth of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism? Are we going to be a church that reflects a God whose image is found in the diverse humanity that God has created? Or are we going to be a church that reflects an Anglo-Saxon God, carrying forth narratives of white supremacy and anti-Blackness? To be sure, if we do not do anything to contest these narratives, and if we do not tell the truth about who we are, then we have made a decision about the kind of nation and the kind of church we want to be. I end there. Thank you.